to work with diverse.
All right. Assalamu alaikum. I'm your host Khatib Munir and welcome to Diversity Watcher Show about loneliness. This is powered by VoxNet Solutions and supported by the National Lottery Community Fund. In today's show, we will talk about the unpopular topic of loneliness, a state of mind that affects everyone from all ages and all communities. But before we go into today's show, let's go to our pastor for a prayer.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining in this series of the post-COVID conferences. And we want to say thank you to the invited guests who have come from various backgrounds. We want to say thank you. And we believe that as you join us today, you will be blessed by the information that they will be giving to us that will improve our mental health issues. God bless you. Let us pray. Father, we want to say thank you and glory be to your name. Thank you for this wonderful day. Thank you for this blessed day. Thank you for the wonderful weather. Thank you, Lord God Almighty, for that which you are going to do in our lives today through your children who will be talking to us about how to overcome loneliness even in these challenging times. Father, we ask that at the end of it all, may everyone watching, everyone who will be joining, and everyone who would even watch later, may they all be blessed from all that we'll be discussing this afternoon. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for in Jesus' name we have prayed. Amen. Thank you. God bless.
And thank you to our pastor for that lovely prayer. And today I'm going to be joined by two guests. We have Victor Sahunter, a health and social care consultant, and Shepherd Nariwa, a mental health specialist. So Victor, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience who are watching today's show?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Victor Sahunter. I'm a health and social care consultant. I've been working in this field for about 20 years, and I'm really pleased to be joining you for this afternoon session on loneliness.
And we are grateful for you here, Victor. And my other guest, Shepherd Nariwa. Shepherd, would you like to please introduce yourself to the audience today?
Hi, yes, I'd like to thank you first of all for inviting me over to the show. And yeah, my name is Shepherd Nariwa. I'm a specialist CAMS mental health practitioner with background of also specializing in psychosis assessment across the board.
Thank you, Shepherd.
And I'm really happy to join the panel to discuss the issue of loneliness in mental health.
Yes, thank you, Shepherd. And as you said, loneliness is a topic that is not discussed in the BAME community. So I suppose, Victor, does that make the BAME community more vulnerable to loneliness? Is that more prevalent in BAME communities?
Yes, I think so. Loneliness affects all communities, whichever community you're in. But I think there are extenuating factors that make loneliness even more greater in the BAME communities. So that would be my sort of opening line to you, and then we will explore some of those factors in a short while.
Yeah, of course. And what factors do you think that make BAME communities more susceptible to loneliness?
I think if you look at just the BAME communities from an angle of not being part of the host country, so we're talking about things like discrimination, prejudice, racism, xenophobia, and those factors alone, where you feel less valued, means that you are likely to feel loneliness. Let's not forget loneliness is different to isolation,
Of course. And Shepherd, I suppose, since we talk especially about BAME communities, do you think that there's less involvement of family members who need to help those who are suffering loneliness?
I think, it's quite a good sort of topic, I guess. Again, it's quite broad, but in terms of involvement, I think that for me is based on people's awareness, in the community. If the awareness is there, then I think you're onto a good start. So I guess in answer to your question is that my answer would be really that I think we need to be identifying the level of awareness that's actually there at the moment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's very well said, Shepard. So I suppose, Victor, do you think there's any particular age group that are more vulnerable? So let's say in the BAME communities, do you think there's one certain age group that's more susceptible to loneliness?
The easiest answer is to say to you, it's the elderly in our community. That is a fact. But I think we need to be wider than that. There are many people in our communities that are feeling loneliness. I mean, we don't think of young people as being lonely, but they are because of the current situation we're in. But I would say, to answer your question, it is going to be the elderly and the vulnerable adults in our communities.
I'm just looking from the statistics from ONS,
Yeah.
and they say that working age adults living alone were more likely to report loneliness, both often or always, and over the past 7 days than the average adult. So what they were saying is that the working age adults are more likely to become lonely.
They're more likely to become lonely.
More likely to be lonely.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that, or do you think there's more to it than just from the statistics?
If we're talking about this current pandemic, then I accept fully that working people will feel loneliness because their whole world has been turned upside down. Whereas if we look at other parts of our communities, like the elderly, remember, loneliness hasn't just appeared in this year. It's been with us, and it will be well after COVID has gone away. So I do accept the point that working people are feeling alone because a lot of the interactions that happen, and I ask you this very simple point, and that is, how many hours do people spend at work, and how many hours in a day do they spend at home? Yeah, so they get that.
I mean, I suppose the hours between spending at home and work are pretty much together.
And at the
Working from
moment,
home
that's
is
the
fine,
problem,
yes,
isn't it? We don't have those demarcation lines. So, you know, I've done a lot of Zoom chats, as we're doing with our colleagues here today. But it's the same. Yeah? And you can still feel that you're very lonely because you've gone back into that world. And in fact, my laptop these days gets more of my attention than any member of my family.
I mean, unfortunately, that is the case with everyone. I mean, of course, we have online lessons now. We have people doing Zoom meetings, people doing conference calls on their laptops. So I bet you people build better relationships with their laptops than
Yes.
with family members themselves. I suppose I think that does put to the point that are there any factors that play upon loneliness?
Are there any factors?
That play upon loneliness or barriers to belonging? So do you think that laptops or technology kind of is a barrier for people to getting out of loneliness?
I would say simply this. How many times do we spend on our IT, on our mobile phones, and the point, how many times do we actually chat? How many times do we connect with the human being? Yeah? We actually, I mean, I'll give you an example. Because of COVID, I've not been able to see my elderly mother who is lonely. Yeah? Yes, I can have a FaceTime conversation, but it isn't the same. Yep. And we need to reach out when COVID is finished to those people in our communities, yeah, who are lonely by offering them that human connection. We are human animals. We need that connection.
And I suppose that does give you the question to you, Shepard. Do you think family interaction and having a sense of togetherness, do you think that's one way to beat loneliness for an individual?
Yes, certainly. Certainly. I think that is an issue that we look at across the board where people have constantly been craving for that kind of contact with other people. As a family, I would say there is likely to have still been, despite the pandemic, there's likely to have still been an issue with communication. Again, back to what you mentioned earlier about technology, about gadgets, where people are using those, even within a family. You will find that there is a lot more of that going on even now. So I would say loneliness, back to the question, loneliness would also arise because people are not really actually communicating in the way that we've always known communication to be, or reaching out to each other or identifying if there are any issues from a point of view of, say, an individual not communicating their struggle, for example. If there were any struggles at all, any emotional needs, etc. People are just glued onto the gadget. And I think that in itself is quite, I'll put it as a negative kind of impact, in the sense that people are not taking time to really get to talk to each other and reach out to each other. I think as was mentioned earlier, about when the pandemic is over, maybe we need to start to acknowledge that there is need to reach out to each other across the communities and find out how people are, that sort of thing. If that makes sense, really.
And I suppose because as Victor said, that elderly are more vulnerable to being lonely. But since the young people are apparently, there's been research that young people are more resistant to being lonely because of social media and because of they are able to use technology to their advantage. But with elderly people, that doesn't seem to be the case. So do you think, especially in this pandemic where family interaction is not allowed pretty much in this pandemic, so do you think that elderly people are being more susceptible to loneliness, and do you think it's harder for them to come out of it?
I certainly think so, yes. You're quite right there. I think they're about to literally have some kind of downward spiral, in the sense that they are not so well versed with the technology. As you put, young people would be much more well versed with getting online, getting to access all the social media platforms that exist. But for me, really, even that, I look at it as something that's not particularly real in terms of the interaction that you would have face to face with people. So the elderly are already in a bracket where they've gradually been sort of left behind, if you like. I don't know whether that's the right phrase to use, but they've not particularly been involved in a lot of the interaction. And I guess when you compare young people have each other to some extent, even though they may face their own challenges as young people. But for the elderly, once there's a lack of the regular contact, they probably gradually become unwell and unsettled, and loneliness really sort of creeping so strongly.
So I suppose, Victor, since we're talking about loneliness and in the BAME community, do you think, because we know that in this British society, there seems to be a stigma attached to BAME communities. Do you think that is a case? That's why there's not many BAME communities or BAME members are not going out to other people?
I think stigma is very, very important. I think we have to recognize that people in our communities do not want to discuss issues which are really prevalent to their heart.
And I just want to start to interrupt you, because we have a question from an anonymous user. So they say, what is the link between loneliness and mental health, and how can this be prevented?
Loneliness and mental health is very serious issues, and we need to look at the impact, the effects of loneliness. And at its worst extreme, I mean, I'm familiar with individuals that have suffered depression, have suffered many serious illnesses, which have been brought on the fact that loneliness is the key factor. And sadly, there will be people in the communities who have attempted or committed suicide as well. So we mustn't look at that. How can we prevent it? Lots of different ways. And I think what's important here, as Shepard touched on earlier, it is about contact, it is about communication, it is about a number of things, about community activities, engagement. Remember, people who are lonely are going to be disenfranchised. Yeah? The only conversation that some people have is the television. And we need to break that chain, if I can put it like that.
And I suppose, Shepard, just adding on to Victor's response, do you think there's been challenges in this pandemic to tackle loneliness and to help those who are lonely to become unlonely, basically?
I think there have been more challenges in relation to loneliness, particularly so with the pandemic being prevalent at the moment, because if you think about it, people were already lonely prior to the pandemic.
Yeah.
They are probably likely to be even lonelier because of the isolating, the sort of lockdown situation, if you like, you know. So that quite a challenge, I would think, you know, in the sense that people are in total shutdown and they end up almost being forgotten, if you like. Like I said earlier, I think there is quite a lot of concern in relation to the elderly, you know, being really cut off completely from the regular community activities, you know.
And I
I think there
suppose,
needs to be
with
time.
this, sorry,
Oh,
you can go
sorry.
ahead. Sorry, you can go ahead.
I was going to say, I think there probably is a need to have some sort of way in which all that could change for the better in relation to, you know, and a sort of outreach kind of system that could be put in place, I suppose. Just wishful thinking.
And one user asked, can you still be lonely whilst you're surrounded by people? So have you come across any cases where people have felt lonely even though they had family interaction, they had friends, they had social support? Do you think that's a case in your experience?
Yes, I mean, from experience of working with people in the community where they are living alone anyway, and you're sort of obviously linked to them as a professional, going to them to sort of support them in relation to whatever reasons they are in the system, you know, for getting the support. You find that there are people who are surrounded by family members, but can be quite lonely in the sense that they find it difficult to talk to their loved ones, for example, about their difficulties. So they may be facing a lot of the issues that build up to becoming more of the mental health issues that they eventually end up with. So you're quite right there that there is that possibility that you know, a lot of cases where people are lonely but still surrounded by the people that you would suppose would help with that loneliness, you know, people that would be in a position to support them. So again, it's about how people reach out to each other, I think, and how they can identify some of the difficulties that their loved ones might face.
And so another user asked that they feel lonely whilst they are married. So do you think, because of course marriage is complicated, we have ups and downs in marriages, but when you feel lonely whilst you're married, so how do you think people can improve their relationship with their husband or their wife so they don't feel lonely anymore?
Yeah, I think with that as well, and marriage is another broader issue on its own, really, for those who obviously with the experience in marriages. But I think, as you say, you may have a situation where there is a communication breakdown, and in actual fact, with the improvements for that, I think, again, like I said earlier, about the awareness being there. How are you going to be more aware of the fact that there is an issue? Say in a marriage situation, there are all sorts of different factors. I'm sure Victor will agree with me. All sorts of different factors that would affect relationships in general, let alone just marriage. But you will find people get to the point where once the communication breakdown happens, you find it difficult to communicate over a period of time, and some people may potentially reach a breaking point because they've not had the support that they need. So going back to your question, I think there is a way to improve that, where you become aware of the organizations out there that can facilitate in giving the appropriate support for people who are lonely within a situation like marriage, for example. Counseling services, etc. Again, that's based on people reaching out to those particular services or people being aware of their existence. You know, so if, for example, I'm a person that's lonely, I have no clue what's out there, I am completely shut off from everything else, you know, that would prove to be quite challenging to get the right kind of support.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting a lot of questions in from our audience, so please do send your questions in. We have two experts here that are my guests. So please, if you have any questions, please send them in. And we have a question for you, Victor. So an anonymous person asks, what can we do to bring BAME communities together? So if they're not working together, the BAME communities, then how can we start to work with non-BAME communities?
We must recognise there's an awful lot of good work going in our communities. Perhaps what we're not doing as good is connecting together. And, opportunities like today where we're going right across the BAME communities, we're sending them a strong message that we can actually work together. And we need to produce information, we need to have radio shows, we need to be having more cultural events together, rather than individual communities doing their own thing. And there's a lot of opportunities out there where we can work together. And I may also add there may be some possibilities of funding that we can draw down to facilitate. So communities need to work together, but it goes back to connecting. As colleagues just said, it's about communication and connecting with the big wide world. And remember, there are people in our communities who don't actually go outside their front door. How do we get them? Now, how do we actually bring individualistic level on a community level and even to the point where we actually involve sessions of delivery which are about prevention? Because that's what it's about, because loneliness has been with us. How do you prevent it? And one of the key drivers is the need for people to say, we can, we will challenge it, because it's going to be a challenge. It's about feeling valued, and we go back to that. I say to myself, when was the last time that I actually went and saw members of a community who I don't know on a personal level? So we need to reach out, we need to go, we need to bring people together, and together we can do it. It's not about, Asian community or African community, it's about the whole community coming together and in discussion, talking and how best we can support. And we've already identified that the elderly are more of a target group for us. So what we need to do is to share our values, to share our fairness and our justice, and say to people, we're here for you. That's what they need. And one of the questionnaires was talking earlier about being in isolation. Can you be lonely in a relationship? Can you be lonely? Many BAME communities that I've worked in, and I'm a member of the BAME community, we come from large families. And it's unthinkable to think that in large families we still get people that are lonely, but we do. And that is because we don't connect, or we connect with certain members of our families because they're in tune with our thought. We need to go beyond that.
And I suppose with social media has a big influence with television and social media. I think those two are the biggest influences that could affect the relationship between each community. So do you think, especially with the fake news and disinformation, do you think that kind of made the gap between two communities bigger or smaller?
We need to make sure that we challenge fake news at every opportunity. We mustn't be afraid of conversation. If somebody says something against my community, I want to discuss that. I want to challenge it. I want to learn. I want to listen. And I think if we do that, then communities, the BAME communities, together can work through this challenge that we have. Because after COVID, loneliness will still be there. And members of our communities will lonely be prior to that. And the challenge has to be, how can we best support individuals together?
And I suppose let's get things more recent. We have the vaccination program being uptaken by the government, and there's been seen like a decrease or a lack of uptake from BAME communities to take the vaccine. So do you think that would kind of increase the gap between each member in the community? Because some people might believe that the vaccine is right and we should take it, whereas others, they believe they don't take it, and that could kind of separate them from the social support bubble.
All I would say to everybody, please get your jab. I mean, I had mine yesterday afternoon, and I'm still in agony for it. But, I said to my mother, who's, 74 years of age now, And I said to her, what choice do you have if you don't do it? The likelihood of you catching a serious illness, yeah? But by having the jab, you're going to be protected. So this fake news that's around, and I've read it and I've seen it on social media, we need to challenge that. And we need to say it to our people in our communities. This is something that's going to save lives. Yeah? Did we not have the same kind of issues with other vaccinations? We came through them, and we need to support that. And our health professionals, I think we ought to take the opportunity of thanking them for the wonderful work they're doing. But at the end of the day, I have been delighted to see a number of our celebrities, going out there into their communities and saying, "You must take the jab." And I think it's very, very important. Because if we don't, we will get more loneliness. Yeah, we will actually get people who are not getting the vaccination. They're going to be ostracized by the communities.
Of course, yeah.
And and let's take it a stage further. Is that if we, and it's been said that it's been denied by the government, but at the end of the day, it is about a vaccine passport. So if you haven't got a passport, are you a second-class citizen? Are you going to get different feelings of power and isolation? And therefore, what's going to happen is you're going to hide yourself even more. And the third point I want to make is about denial. A lot of our people will be in denial that loneliness, it's just me. I can take, I can handle it, I can deal with it. But they don't understand the impact of loneliness.
Well, I suppose that has been the question because an anonymous user asks you the question, how do you identify loneliness, and at what stage does it become a risk to one's mental health or general well-being?
How do you identify it? I mean, I think we can see it quite clearly. We work with people, we know members of our family, we know people in the communities. I would say simply this, that if somebody's behavior has changed, and it can be all sorts of factors, but BAME communities do not like to share things about themselves in the communities. Like they say, don't do your dirty washing in public.
Of course.
So that leads us to people keeping their own health conditions, their own marital relationships, etc. And I would say, go and talk to people. And there was a question earlier about marital relationships, and I would say to that particular person, please use our pastors, our mosque leaders, our Gurdwara prayer, anybody in our community who can give you that viewpoint.
And I suppose, Shepherd, onto that same question, when do you think loneliness becomes a risk to a person's mental health?
Okay. I think, yes, it becomes quite a sense that if there is a deterioration in communication or breakdown in communication, the relationships might suffer and no one's communicating to each other, but you will find those individuals affected could potentially go on that downward spiral of having negative thoughts, having a lot of overthinking in relation to, a lot of issues like now, as you can imagine, with the pandemic existing as part of our lives at the moment, there are people who would have been already quite anxious about life, about the future, about themselves, about their own relationships. And then now if you can then imagine how that may be for them at this point, some people might literally be in their homes really so lonely to the point of getting to the risk point of literally even contemplating suicide. And this is a reality. That is another subject that probably don't talk about that much, broadly.
And I suppose the lesser extreme effects of loneliness, because one user asks that they get social anxiety. So is that an effect, a consequence of prolonged loneliness, or would that be something else related to loneliness?
I think coupled with a whole lot of other factors affecting the individual. Again, each individual has different circumstances affecting them. That makes sense. But I would say, yes, it would be potentially something that would lead to the risky point of someone seeking help when they could have, for example, or maybe people missing certain signs, because it's easy for all of us to think, oh, so-and-so's fine, we saw them the other day, they're okay, and then they're shocked when we then hear something else that's happened to them in such a negative way that we wish we would have intervened. As individuals, you don't have to be a professional to actually make a difference in someone's life. People themselves, I think, as Victor mentioned earlier, you've got pastors, you've got others, you've got people around you that might be in position to support. Then again, it's about the awareness. Are people going to identify things easily? People can see someone is lonely, for example, but sometimes it's those that aren't being noticed. Everything's masked and they seem to be okay when they're not. You see what I mean?
Yeah, of course.
That is something we need to be looking at and thinking about how we could do better. Pandemic or no pandemic, we still have to find ways to ensure that we are all okay. Even those who are successful, doing well, working, they get affected by so many different factors and can literally be so lonely to the point that they have been imagined by anyone. So it's about still that consistency, that communication that continues one way or the other. Again, it can be quite challenging. It can be quite difficult to identify sometimes. But again, we are faced with many communities. I think we're faced with so much of the stigma, but then again, stigma around mental health, that is across the board, no matter what background people are from. I think that itself is something that is a barrier to most people, and maybe a lack of understanding of what input support be available.
I suppose with you, Victor, the approach to loneliness in BAME communities is different, isn't it, to, let's say, white communities. So let's say, for example, an individual is experiencing loneliness, even though they have their extended families, their social support, yet they still feel loneliness. What approach do you think their parents, so from your experience, what approach do they take to tackle that in comparison to white communities?
I think, we have to first of all accept that whatever community you're in, loneliness happens. But I think in the black community, we come from a culture where we accept certain things and there's certain things that we don't accept. And we're all, and I make a male comment, macho men, yeah? We don't want to talk, we hide behind. So I think we needed a program of activity and engagement with people. We can talk to them, we can discuss, loneliness. And there's a lot of support in the communities at a local level, yeah? Then of course, national organizations, my colleague just talked about suicide, there's lots of organizations that can provide that through Samaritans and from mine. But in our own BAME communities, we need really to focus on how do we actually get people to be engaged. Now, there's a lot of community activities. And I've had the pleasure of going to some of these committees, but what I find is that while these activities are on, people can't get access to them. Yeah? So some of our elderly people who are lonely at home are looking at the television 24 hours literally. How do we actually get? So we need to provide, basic transport, for example, yeah, to get people. We may need, people to support with interpretation, so, language. I'm talking about translating. We may need to think about what is right for them. For some people, one-to-one is far more important than group work, but it is about getting people involved, and it's breaking that cycle of loneliness, which ultimately leads to mental health, which clearly leads to depression, and in some cases, sadly, it leads to the inevitable. What we can do is to work with our communities, and we need to ensure that individuals support each other, and really looking at how do we actually get to the root of the problem. But loneliness is many factors. People can be in relationship. We haven't talked about poverty yet, because that brings loneliness, because everything you go down to the shops costs. So if you haven't any money, look at the queues in their food banks. Yeah. So if you look at loneliness and poverty and incomes, BAME communities always suffer. And of course, the only thing we can do is by engagement, by bringing people together and coming and talking about these issues, people will feel hopefully they can break that cycle.
Yeah, you talked about societal norms, the machoism. With the BAME communities, you have the Western social norms, and then you have their own cultural norms. Now, we see, especially in Britain, there's so much institutions like Samaritans that can help you beat loneliness. But at the same time, you talked about machoism, how traditionally and stereotypically men are meant to hide their feelings, they're meant to hide their kind of flaws. So do you think those who know that they have the institutions available to help them at their disposal, do you think that kind of, because of their family norms and their culture, do you think that prevents them from actually reaching out to
Absolutely.
help?
I think you're spot on there. And I think it is, again, the way that it's part of our DNA, I would say to you. Yeah? From all BAME communities, we want to keep things to ourselves. If you said to somebody, how much money do you earn? They wouldn't answer that question. And yet I know that between a certain friend, I would openly say that. But there are some taboo subjects, and loneliness is one of those taboo subjects that we need to get people to come and feel part. And I'll go back to my opening word. It's about feeling valued. If you feel valued, whether you're in a family, whether you're in a marital relationship, or whether you're in the community, if you feel valued, you should not be feeling the signs of loneliness. And if you feel unvalued, unloved, whether it's at a personal level or, nothing in the community to do, then you are going to feel lonely. And remember, just because you're in a large group doesn't mean to say you're not lonely. And isolation is different to loneliness.
And we're getting a couple of questions from our viewers here. So one person asks, anonymous, can we form an online BAME community group which includes prominent BAME personalities?
So can we form an online, which one are you doing?
Can we form an online BAME community group which includes prominent BAME personalities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can develop that. And I think people like yourself are in a great position. And people like Febby and yourselves could easily coordinate a group together. And there's plenty of personalities, experts like Chevy who come from medical professional, and people like myself. We can come together and start to break this cycle. But it is, I think the opportunity is there. And after COVID, and we're repeating the point, after COVID, loneliness will still be there. At the moment, we're using that people are lonely because they're in their houses because of COVID. What are we going to do after COVID? And I would say that there are some, number of personalities in our communities at a local level. Dr. Mishara, for example, what I'm sure will be delighted to facilitate, Tyson over at Equality and Diversity, and there are many pastors that I know would be all keen to help our communities recover from this. Because if we don't, sadly we'll pay the price.
Yeah, we got another question from another person, from anonymous user. They said, I feel comfortable with social media activities rather than spending time with people close to me. Could that be an issue?
No, not at all. We're using social media today to talk to people, aren't we?
Pretty much.
So we're actually talking here, and then we've got colleagues answering questions via Zoom. No, I think it's about inclusivity. How do we actually include? And if we don't include, well, what are we doing? We're actually discriminating against them because they're not in the room. So we need to have thinking outside the box, I would say. So absolutely, to the questionnaire, you can be still involved.
And I suppose let's ask you a question, Shepherd. Do you think that social media could increase loneliness depending on what content you view as. So do you think social media plays a part in creating loneliness, or do you think that's out of the question?
I think that could be debatable depending on who you ask, really. But I think from my own personal understanding of social media is that it brings you in contact somehow in that sort of electronic way with people around you. So people do text each other, they communicate and so forth. But I think there's a part where it can also do the opposite, where it takes you away from everybody else around you, the immediate people around you, where there is that disconnect, and there is eventually just you and gadget look at the social media content. That makes sense. So I think it can play two ways, and it depends how that. I mean, if it's helpful to some extent, some people say it's helped for them because it's them going, particularly now with the pandemic situation, some people say that has been a great help because they're there to catch up on news, to see what's happening, read, books online, for example, if they like, or talk to, there's so much of the social interaction with that. But so I would say loneliness could still be there even when that's going on. Yeah, that makes sense.
And do you think the exposure to news too much, so let's say looking at the coronavirus pandemic, do you think too much exposure to that could lead to loneliness via through depression?
I think the exposure to news, for example, and if there is a lot of sad news, as we all know, a lot of people tend to say, I'd rather not see the news because it does depress me. I see, stories about people being killed or a lot of unpleasant situations that they might come across there. So I think that itself could be, something that could be a trigger for some people, which is the case. I've come to realize there are a whole range of issues that I've come across where people have had certain situations in their mental health triggered quite negatively by that exposure.
So I suppose let's go away from modern ways of dealing with loneliness and let's go to traditional ones, religion. There seems to be a higher religiosity amongst BAME communities. So do you think religion plays a part in tackling loneliness, which is why there might be a lower rate of uptake in institutions such as the Samaritans to deal with loneliness?
I think religion plays an important part. And again, with BAME communities, religion is in some people's homes the core. It's the foundation they're built on. And whether it's Christian or whether it's Islam or Sikhism, they're all there and other communities will participate. I think religion has a place. Yeah? Our leaders have a place and family members have a place. It's only by all parts working together, interlinked, will we actually see a reduction in loneliness.
And I suppose with religion itself, do you think religion provides treatments for loneliness in terms of tackling it? And
religion is not going to be, shouldn't be seen as a treatment. I think religion should be seen as an aid, as an enhancing. Remember, if you're talking about treatments, and I would say cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, where experts, if you're talking at that level, but I'm saying religion has a part to play in that.
And just, you made a point of cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT. Shepard, do you think that's effective in tackling loneliness when, let's say, someone is experiencing loneliness, they'll go to a psychologist and receive CBT? Do you think that's a good way to reducing a person's sense of loneliness?
I think certainly, because I think that gives some structure in terms of how they're handling things and how they're managing things. And I think it's a safe way to actually explore the reasons why particular cases of loneliness spring up anyway. So if someone has been identified as having a need to get input from, say, psychology, therapy sessions, etc., And I think that's very helpful. And I think there is a need, as Victor said earlier, about having that support after the pandemic, for example, to ensure that there is more of the support for people across the board in the communities, people accessing various ways, including religion, to get support. In my view, I think when a person goes to get help from the likes of psychologists, etc., that is a very good sign, and I think it's an indication that they are acknowledging that there are some difficulties that they are facing, and there is help out there. I mean, as Vic said as well earlier, there is plenty of organizations, the Samaritans, etc. All those people are in a position to help. But I think it's again down to the level of knowledge or awareness for individuals. Once people have knowledge of the support that's out there, that is a possibility for change in the right direction.
I suppose in this pandemic right now, what support institutions are there for people who experience loneliness right now? Are there any psychologists they can go to? Is the NHS open? Yeah. Or if they're unable to say, let's say because they're shielding, what can they do at home to reduce their sense of loneliness?
Yeah, so if there is something identified, I mean, usually within families, people will identify within their own environment. Sometimes that tends to happen. It could be a father, a son, an uncle, aunt, mother, siblings, or in institutions, for example. Some people may identify someone to have a need, and that someone may not be aware of themselves, but it takes some people to start to identify ways in which they act, for instance, or maybe they've just had a deterioration in their social interaction, the way they used to behave changed drastically. They're then seen as having a need. So I would say in our situation, you're looking at people being able to, for instance, to start with, you asked what could people do to help themselves. I think you start normally with the GP, for example, being made aware that there is a problem, and might mean that they're the first port of call in relation to what could be, happening, and then thereafter there may be a need to signpost an individual to the right center, for example, to mental health service that would look at maybe having an assessment initially done. Now, that assessment usually is a fact-finding point to understand what has been happening. Is there a need to take it any further? We then use that to identify what potentially could be happening. That's where it might lead to some kind of diagnosis sometimes. And sometimes a diagnosis never arises, but you do identify that there are ways in which they could be helped by posting them to the appropriate services that are available in the community. I hope I'm making sense at this point, but these are the things that we need to be looking out for. What does an individual need to be supported to alleviate the loneliness situation?
I suppose I want to bring up a point here, because in BAME communities, let's say if a child was experiencing loneliness, a teenager, but the BAME communities, especially because their core values are, let's say, the machoism, that could be prevalent in the family, and that kind of prevents them from speaking out and say to the parents, I feel lonely, this is what I'm experiencing. What would you say to them to help them kind of reach out to the parents and say, this is what I'm feeling right now?
I would say to young people who are suffering from loneliness is really just talk to people. Look at the issues that you have and talk to your parents, talk to your relatives, and really the family is there to support you. Yeah, and if you're really feeling lonely, there will be other people outside your family network. Perhaps share your concerns with the teacher Perhaps share your concerns with, if you happen to go to social activities when COVID's over, a youth club. Don't suffer in silence. That's what I would say. And I think an important message that I'd want to say to family and friends for those who are suffering with loneliness, listen to them. And I don't mean hearing. And I'll say this, hearing is with the ears, listening with the mind. Yeah? Listen carefully where they're at. You aren't going to be able to change somebody's loneliness overnight. What you can do is show them a clear path. And it may be, some professional treatments, medication. It may be simply that they're lonely because of their circumstances. And some of the circumstances we can, by just discussion alone, start to make inroads. But clearly, go and talk to your GP, go and talk to the nurse. There are many, many individuals in our communities who can provide that elementary level of support without, the realms of the medical profession.
Yeah, and I think that we should end our show right there. I would like to thank my two guests, Shepard and Victor, for joining us in today's show. And I hope this show has been very informative and you could get something out of this. And I'd like to thank Diversity Watch for organising this show. And of course, this show sponsor is powered by VoxNet Solutions and supported by the National Lottery Community Fund. So that is all for today's show. I hope you enjoyed it as we have. And hopefully we will see you next Saturday with another programme. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.